Some people think that despite all of the cultural differences that exist in the world, that there are moral principles, that there are moral ideas that human beings have in common, sort of regardless of time, regardless of culture. And these folks say that human beings don't invent moral principles, they discover moral principles. And then they have to decide how to respond to the moral principles. And so these people don't say that there are moral principles that all human beings have access to, and therefore all human beings access these moral principles and then act accordingly. They say human beings have access to certain moral principles regardless of where they live, regardless of time, but human beings are certainly capable of rejecting moral principles, of ignoring moral principles, of not wanting to pay attention to moral principles. But the idea that these folks have is that there are moral principles that all human beings throughout the world, all different cultures, all different historical moments, that there are moral principles that human beings have in common. And what good laws reflect, according to these people, are sort of nuts and bolts responses to the moral law. Now, there are some laws that are immoral. So, for example, if you live in Nazi Germany and you know that your neighbor is hiding a Jew, right, from the Nazi authorities, well, then there's a law that says that you should tell the Nazi authorities that your neighbor is hiding a Jew. According to Nazi law, that's what you should do. I think most of us would recognize that that's not a moral law. So just because something is a law doesn't mean it's moral. But under most circumstances in the world we live in, most laws do reflect a certain kind of morality. So, for example, here's a law. Don't drive 25 miles an hour, or don't drive faster than 25 miles an hour when you're going through a neighborhood. That's the law. And if you break the law and a police officer catches you, then the police officer might give you a ticket, so that's the law. But what that law reflects is a moral principle. And the moral principle is that we should look out for the well-being of other people. If we're going through a neighborhood, then children might be playing, people might be walking around, right? People's pets might be around, etc. And so we should take care. That's the principle. We should not unnecessarily endanger one another, okay? Now that's a moral principle. Now the way people will respond to that moral principle will differ. Some people will say, look, driving a car even 25 miles an hour, that's dangerous. If a kid runs out in the street and gets hit by a car going 25 miles an hour, that's still a dangerous thing, right? So some communities might say, oh no, you have to go 15 miles an hour and we're going to have speed bumps. Or some communities might say, you can't drive here at all. This is pedestrian only. But you have an underlying moral principle. Human beings should look out for the welfare of others, right? And one of the ways that people might respond to that moral law is by having human laws like this, municipal city laws like this. Don't drive faster than 25 miles an hour, okay? And so this is what people who have this view say, that there are moral principles that exist sort of out there in the universe, right? And the human's job is to learn what those moral principles are, and then to figure out how to put them into effect in the world. And of course, there will be disputes and debates among people about the best way to do that. So what's interesting is where this one is very clear, don't drive faster than 25 miles an hour. This one seems to be more of a direct appeal to moral principle. If you had kids living here, how would you want other people to drive, right? So interesting, there's not a specific number here, right? There's not a specific law, at least announced here. What there is an appeal to a moral principle. How would you want other people to drive if your kids were playing in this neighborhood? Right? So that's a clear moral appeal. And notice, by the way, the assumption of the people who put up this sign that other people will get it, right? Oh, okay, yes, I understand. I understand. If I had kids playing in this neighborhood, then I would not want people screaming through here at 50 miles an hour, right? So this kind of, gets at this idea that human beings share certain moral ideas. They share certain moral principles, and these moral principles can be appealed to. Okay? So as we've said, people who take this idea that there is a moral law that exists independently of human beings, it exists outside human beings, they say that human beings don't invent these principles, but they do have a choice as to how they will respond. So I can know perfectly well that it's not smart and it's not a decent thing to scream 50 miles an hour through a neighborhood, right? But I can decide to do it anyway. Now, one of the modern books that gets into this theme a little bit, this theme of, this idea that there's a law that exists independently of human beings, it's by a writer, an English writer named C.S. Lewis. And the book is called The Abolition of Man. Now, in this book, C.S. Lewis refers to this moral power, to this set of moral principles, to this moral law. He refers to it as the Tao, right? Which is a Chinese word, okay? And we have this quote down below, the Tao, which others may call natural law. Some may use that phrase. They refer to natural law. That is, law that exists in nature. And not just, a law that, the laws that keep the planet spinning and tilting, at a certain, predictable speeds and at a certain predictable rate, etc. Not those kinds of natural laws, but natural moral laws. Some people just might use the phrase traditional morality. Some people might use the phrase first principles. We've seen in other videos, there's the concept of the logos, right? In one, these concepts kind of overlap. And C.S. Lewis uses the Chinese term, the Tao. And he says, his claim is that the Tao, this natural law, this logos, to use a phrase we've talked about in other videos, is the sole source of all value judgments. So if I say, driving 50 miles an hour through a neighborhood is wrong, that's a value judgment. I'm making a moral judgment. Well, on what basis? Well, I can say because it's against the law, because that sign there says 25 miles an hour. I can make that appeal, and that's a legitimate appeal. It's against the law. But why is it wrong? That tells me why it's illegal, but why is it wrong? It's wrong because I'm jeopardizing the welfare of people living in that neighborhood. There are other answers to that question. Do you see the distinction? You could tell the person, look, don't drive through here 50 miles an hour because the sign says 25, right? And you can say, and what you did is illegal. But suppose the person responds and says, okay, I understand that it's illegal, but why is it wrong? All right, and there you've got to come up with a reason. Well, why is it wrong? I see that it's illegal, but why is it wrong in some deeper sense? And Lewis says that when we think about those kinds of questions, if something is not just if something is legal or illegal, but if it's right or wrong, then this is an appeal to something deeper. This is an appeal to something more profound. And Lewis uses the term in this book, the Tao, to refer to this set of moral principles. Okay? So, as it says there, this term that Lewis uses is Chinese. And we've seen in different videos, the Greeks, the Romans, the Christians, the early Christians, they had this term logos, which means reason. It's a creative force. It's a moral force. It has different meanings for different people, but there's overlap with this concept that Lewis uses, the Tao. Now, what we're going to see in the next few screens are three sets of quotes. And the three sets of quotes come from two sources. One source is the Dhammapada, right, which is a collection of the teachings of Buddha, right? So Buddhist teachings from ancient Asia, okay? And then we have some moral statements from the New Testament, okay? Actually also from Asia, from Western Asia, right? Because present-day Israel is Western Asia, right? And so we've got two or three sets of moral statements from different sources. And what we want to look at are the similarities. And so what we're noticing is we've got two ancient documents, although the Dhammapada is more ancient than the New Testament, and they come from different parts of the world. Okay, so the New Testament from, present-day Israel, present-day Turkey, that area, right? The Dhammapada, present-day India, okay? And so two different documents from different parts of the world, separated by a few hundred years, and yet I think we're going to see some moral similarities. And this is the kind of thing people point to when they say, you know what, maybe there are moral principles that human beings share in common. And so what similarities do we see? And also, if you see differences, then you'll note that as well. And then it says down there at the bottom there that the Dhammapada, that's linked to a word, the Dhamma, and the Dhamma has a meaning which is broadly similar to the Tao and the Logos. I don't want to say that these terms mean the exact same thing. I don't want to say that the Dhamma, the Tao, and the Logos mean the exact same thing. But there does seem to be an overlap, right? This idea that there's a moral law that exists independently of human beings, right? And the human's job is to figure out what that moral law is and then to respond to it. Let's do the first one together, and then I'm going to leave sets 2 and 3 to you. Let's look at the first quote from the Dhammapada. How easily the wind overturns a frail tree. Seek happiness in the senses, indulge in food and sleep, and you too will be uprooted. The wind cannot overturn a mountain. Temptation cannot touch the man who is awake, strong and humble, who masters himself and minds the law. So we have, there's kind of this or that. If you want to indulge in the senses, if you want to, be fixated on food and sleep, that is ease. If you don't want to be devoted to serious things, the text seems to be saying, then you're going to be easily uprooted. The wind will blow you over. If, on the other hand, you don't want to be easily blown over by the winds, and I think this means the difficulties of life, the troubles that come to us in life, right? If we don't want to be easily blown over by the troubles that come to us in life, if we want to be more like a mountain which cannot be blown over by the troubles and the winds of life, then what do we want to do? We want to be awake. We want to be strong. We want to be humble. We want to master ourselves. And we want to mind the law. What's the law? I think the Dhamma, the Tao, the Logos, right? So this is an idea. There's a way to go that leads to weakness and breakdown, and there's a way to go that leads to strength. That seems to be at least one of the things that top text is saying. Let's look at this one from the Gospel of Matthew. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine. Now this is Jesus teaching. All right, so Jesus is teaching, and he's saying, look, if you listen to me and you put them into practice, then you're like a wise man who built his house on a rock. So you've got your foundation, right? And so you put your house on the rock, right? So Jesus is saying, look, my teaching is like a rock. And if you want to have a steady life, listen to what I'm saying, put it into practice. That's like building a house on a rock. The rain came, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. You see the similarity? In the first bit, up in the Dhammapada, we've got wind, easily blowing something down. In this case, we've got, the storm and the rain, but it's the same idea, right? The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew against and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock, kind of like up above, where the person who is awake and strong and humble and who has mastered himself and who has minded the law, this person is not easily overblown. The teaching in the New Testament is this person, this house, standing in for the metaphor of a life, is not easily overblown if the life is founded on the teaching, right? But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. Do you see the similarity? In both cases, you have a crash, you have something that falls. In both cases, you have something that stands, right? What's the difference? In both cases, minding in the Dhammapada, minding the law. In the second case, minding the teaching of Jesus, right? Okay, now we are talking about different things. Buddhist teaching and the teaching of Jesus do go in very, very different directions, right? No question about that. But let's just notice the similarity here. And I mean, this might be an interesting research project for you. I mean, how do they go differently? Because I think everyone will agree, well, this is kind of similar. There's certainly some similarities here, right? But when the rubber hits the road, so to say, and we actually need to put into practice the teaching of the Dhammapada, put into practice the teaching of Jesus, then, to what extent do the paths diverge? And I think the paths do diverge. But let's just notice that there does seem to be an underlying principle here that these two things have in common. And that is that a wise person who does not want to be blown about by the wind, a wise person who does not want to easily collapse before the pressures of life, right? This person will root his or her life in important things. This person will root his or her life in meaningful things, right? If you want to be strong in life, if you want to withstand the storms of life, then it's really important, both of these documents seem to be saying, to root your life in something meaningful, in something deep, in something important. Do these two systems of thought represented by the Dhammapada and the Gospel of Matthew, do they lead in different directions in terms of daily life, etc.? I think so. But you see the similarity here, right? You see the similarity, at least in kind of this starting point, this principle that the two texts here seem to have in common. Okay, we've done that work together. Now let's just look at these next two sets, but I'm going to leave it to you. Okay, the Dhammapada says, however many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do you if you do not act upon them? Straightforward question from the Dhammapada. This comes to us from the book of James in the New Testament. Be doers of the word, and then I've given you the Greek word there, logu, which means it's from the word logos, right? So those of us who have some familiar with that word logos, that's the Greek word that's being used here. Be doers of the word and not hearers only. Otherwise you are deceiving yourselves. For anyone who hears the word but does not carry it out is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror and after observing himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. Okay? Now expressed a little bit differently, but I think if you read those texts over, I think you'll pretty quickly notice an interesting similarity, an interesting principle. Okay, let's look at the next set. Dhammapada says we are what we think. All that we are arises within our thoughts. With our thoughts we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind and trouble will follow you. Speak or act with a pure mind and happiness will follow you. Okay, that's the Dhammapada. Now we have Jesus' words as recorded in the Gospel of Mark. Do you not understand? Nothing that enters a man from the outside can defile him because it does not enter his heart, but it goes into the stomach and then is eliminated. Okay? Now we don't want to push this too far. Of course, if you consume 3 gallons of ice cream in one sitting, in some sense that is going to defile you. Okay? But that's not really the point that's being made here. Okay? So let's keep going. What comes out of a man, that is what defiles him. In other words, what comes from the heart of a person is what defiles that person. For from within the hearts of men come evil thoughts, envy, slander, arrogance, and foolishness. All these evils come from within, and these are what defile a man. So I would say, you kind of focus on that bottom half in the section from the Gospel of Mark, compare that with the Dhammapada, and I think we see a similarity here. I think we see there's a principle at work. There's no question that, as we've said, the teaching of the Dhammapada, if you follow it and put it into practice within a community of people who are following this teaching every day, that's on the one hand, and then on the other hand you have people who are putting into practice the teaching of the New Testament, right? Not just the moral teaching, but all of the teaching that's in the New Testament. I don't think there's any question that we are going to see significant differences, right? We're going to see significant differences in how the world is viewed. We're going to see significant differences in how we should respond to the world. There's no question about that. We're looking at some pretty significant differences. Buddhism and Christianity are very different things. right? But with the people who take this idea that there's a moral law that exists independently of human beings, what they say is, well, of course you have a lot of cultural differences. Human beings are very powerful and creative beings, and they also are prone to self-deception and things like that. You have all kinds of complicating things which will lead to tremendous differences among human beings, right? And some of those differences are wonderful and some of them not so much. But what these people say is, but if you look at it though, you'll notice that there are certain underlying principles that are similar, right? And so that's the idea that we're working with here. And so as you review these three sets of moral statements from the Dhammapada and the New Testament, what similarities do you see? You'll see some differences too, perhaps, but what similarities do we see?